Welcome once again to an episode of the Spinoza Triad, in which the Triad, that is Dr. Richard Miller, Dan Rowland and myself, John Gibbs, discuss philosophy and other things which interest us. Dan's on holiday at the moment, having a very nice time in France, we hope. Richard and I got together to discuss a film we'd watched and relate it to philosophy. While this might sound a noble enterprise, the film was called The Uglies, and we watched it for no other reason than it was trending on Netflix. I think, in hindsight, we watched it so that you don't have to. But nonetheless, it proved to be a reasonably good starting point for a consideration of beauty, aesthetic value, the philosophy of Kant, Schopenhauer, and others. I hope you enjoy our discussion.
Let's start
by
the agreement that I'm baffled and yet astonished by, and I'm also astonished, baffled and astonished by how the film The Uglies is currently trending. Is that a word, trending?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And first of all, I have to preface any observation we make about The Uglies is what you just said before we started recording, is that it's a sort of what do you say? It's an Instagram kind of.
Well, it's an Instagram. It's a movie version of Instagram, isn't it?
A movie Instagram.
Yeah.
So therefore, our age makes us deeply probably unqualified to talk about this movie, the full movie. Yeah.
I want to put my hand up and say I didn't finish it. But broadly speaking, the film just looks at, there's a kind of rite of passage. There's 16 years old, before you're 16, you're known as an ugly. Then you go in for this surgery, body augmentation, whether you come out of there, they call them is it pretties or beautifuls, isn't it? Is it the
pretties?
The pretties, yeah. You come out there a pretty, and we find out a kind of resistance to this movement, who are the uglies, who are sort of like a rebel kind of bunch, aren't they? Yeah. It's a kind of authoritarian kind of regime where you have to abide by.
It's so heavily derivative, cliched. I mean, I was thinking of Logan's Run, which I must have seen in the 70s.
Yeah.
And lots of, there's a place, Mockingbird films, there's a place beyond which there's a sort of wasteland. Somehow there's always a wasteland. Blade Runner, out there somewhere, there's somewhere you can escape to, where the Matrix, all those sort of things. And in this central place, there's an authoritarian regime. But the authoritarian regimes, there seems to be a boundary you can get out to. But of course, when you think about it, the motif of the frontier, the motif of the boundary beyond which there is some wild place where you can escape from the authoritarian, oppressive, possibly government regime, well, it's obvious why that's a continual, as I say, motif, is because it refers to the mythscape of the United States, the frontier itself. From Blade Runner to Chicken Run, for that matter. Get over the fence, get far away. There's a place beyond the hills where you can be free and exercise your freedom in a unique way, the frontier spirit. And that, I think, again, it's not only part of the mythscape of the United States, it's part of the mythscape storytelling of the wanderer who puts the knapsack on his back and heads off to make his fortune. That's possibly one of the oldest motifs in storytelling. Like in Logan's Run, where everyone is killed when they're 30 or something like that, the timer goes off. Or those other, or endless sort of movies where in the future we'll have ability to perfect people, but it won't be, it will be highly unegalitarian.
John, you've just made, that's quite a good point you just brought up there. If we put I love pop culture, and sort of cultural studies-y stuff. And I always think that, the great thing about looking at pop culture is it gives you sort of it gives you a kind of a narrative, a story of the masses, of the popular, because it's what people, it's number one in Netflix. So clearly a lot of people have watched this. And one thing you can get from looking at, I mean, something you just hit on there, Logan's Run, 30 years old. How old is it? Logan's Run, was it 70s? Okay, yeah, so it was a long time ago. But if you think about it, it's a bit like when we talked about vampires before. Look at the narrative there. So in the late 70s, the tipping point of when you were still of any use is like 30 was the mark, wasn't it? Was Logan's Run? Was it 30?
I think so. I think you got, there was a little timer went off and something appeared on your hand.
Yeah.
When your time was up when you're about 30.
But whereas now we look at, like, there's a kind of rite of passage there. We shift the ages there, is now at 16. Sort of contemporary culture moves in this way, in this interest, I think, in beauty, would we call it? In the good looking, in the beautiful, whatever. The age is definitely becoming more and more of a variable. The tipping point now has become even younger.
Yes, on face value, if you before we. So the only reason we tell our listeners to this, the only reason we watch
both of them, yeah,
both of you,
yeah,
Dan, if you're out there,
yeah,
this week, but we have a listener,
yeah.
The reason we watch this because it's trending on Netflix, and so we thought, well, let's watch this. Let's dive off the deep end into popular culture. This is popular in its culture.
Yeah.
Now, it's not a film that people should waste their time watching. Both of us didn't want to finish the end, but it is interesting because I think that, as you say, what is it interesting? It's interesting because it's part of popular culture,
yeah,
and what it says about us. And that idea, at face value, it could be a kind of critique of plastic surgery, body augmentation, pressures placed on young women who are listed as young women to look beautiful, and at 16, you girls, apparently it's not unknown for girls to be having collagen injections or Botox or things of that kind from about 16 onwards.
Yeah,
when childhood sort of ends.
Yeah,
well, we're very blurred. We have a very blurred attitude when childhood ends, I reckon.
Yeah.
But never mind. About 16, and this is when people are designated to now need to be made beautiful.
Well, but in an interesting way, like you say, not a coming of age in adulthood in that sense, but there's a kind of transhuman. I mean, you mentioned this when we spoke on the phone in the week. There is a kind of ever pervasive kind of transhuman element, isn't there? The coming of age in this respect is through surgery, isn't it? Through body modification. It kind of links on slightly to the stuff we did the other week on technological determinism, technofeudalism. Yeah. Where you've got the reality now is becoming more and more a relationship of technology. The self, if you like, is becoming part of this.
It's not unreasonable for us to think if you follow the trajectory of where we're going. We were sharing our dentistry stories before we started.
Yeah.
And if you follow the trajectory of, people have for hundreds of years, mainly since the arrival of refined sugar, had rotten teeth and such like. And these days you can pretty much go to the dentist and have all your choppers replaced with gleaming tombstones. If you follow that trajectory down the line, aren't we one day going to steadily, like a kind of ship of Theseus, replace ourselves bit?
Yeah.
And isn't that something, transhumanism, something we aspire to, something that we would look forward to, something that is inevitable?
And interestingly, if you look at I think the way that's going as well, is this specifically look more at the physical, but in reality, that's happening quite a lot through the psychological, isn't it? Our minds, our sense of self, if you like, is being, the techno-feudalist thing on behavioural modification. The way we actually think about ourselves, and you've got this kind of split. We've got the shift, physical, obviously differences with surgery, but also psychological ones, which are readily affected through technology.
I thought this once when I was watching one of those documentaries, the David Attenborough documentary, and it's something like this is so many leagues beneath the ocean to see the squid, the migrating squid, and these thousands of squid are surging along. And I'm thinking, well, I can see this on my little telly box.
Yeah.
And I'm the first humans in history that can see this, partly because only a century ago you couldn't go down to these depths. Now there's a camera. Now I'm sitting in my living room. I can look into the eye of a squid in the deep ocean, it's altered my sense of my senses. It's hugely augmented my capacity to see the world.
Yeah.
You know, I can think what it's like to see a squid migration of this bottom ocean, or a taxi going to New York if I've never been to New York, or I can see what the moon looks like. Sorry, the Earth looks like from the moon or from far away. All these have augmented through technology.
Yeah. Well, it's and radically normalised. I remember teaching stuff years ago before internet and phones and stuff. You had words like in Anthony Giddens had an expression, time-space distanciation, which sounds a lot, but he basically was talking about the compression of time and space to be immediate, which is something we all take totally for granted now. So in a sense, our sense of self is now immediately, it's disembodied, isn't it? And it's different wherever you speak, wherever you go. If you're on, we're going to talk today about social media and stuff, but there are parts of you everywhere in contact continually, and it's expected that you are. I mean, that's what I think the initial psychological shift is, sort of transhuman shift. But and it becomes more problematic when you realise that algorithms are manipulating then what you think you know and what you don't, and your beliefs almost.
Yes,
John, I think I wanted to get onto though.
Yeah.
So I don't know about you. I mean, I looked at the film, and I saw it as a kind of a symptom of contemporary culture, and by that, in terms of, I was thinking here about Instagram, TikTok, these social medias where a version of yourself, an idealized self, is put out, and there's this idea of beauty or the good looking let's just use the word beauty. What does philosophy say, or what has it said about the idea of beauty? For me, I think that the first starting point was, is beauty in the eye of the beholder? Is it something we agree on? Is something good looking, or someone, or is a piece of art good? Is something beautiful? Is it timeless? Is it in the object, or is it something to discuss? I mean,
I was thinking about this earlier. I was thinking of a sort of imaginary situation, maybe thought experiment.
Yeah.
Elevate it to thought experiment. But if you got in a spaceship,
yeah,
and you sail across the galaxy,
yeah,
and you find this other civilization of creatures, and they take you to a museum.
Yeah.
They say this is our art gallery / museum of all our finest works of precious material. We know you have these on Earth, museum and such like. These are ours. And you go in there, and there's an exhibition of turds.
Right.
Shit. Literally shit. Oh, it's awful. That smells awful.
Yeah.
Oh, no. Yeah, no. Yeah. On our planet, these are deemed highly beautiful. This one particularly.
Yeah.
Kept this one. This is don't touch it. Don't get precious to us. And you think so? Well, would that is that all? Am I saying here is that beauty is in the eye of the beholder? It's entirely culturally, psychologically specific.
Yeah. So
I think there's no universality to it at all.
Something. I mean, and this is something when you read aesthetic stuff with philosophers, they've struggled with trying to find. On the one hand, there's a subjective dimension where I decide something. It's a wonderful turd, but do we all agree that it is? That's the problem. I mean, have you looked at Hume's stuff on this at all?
Yes, yeah.
I looked at. He talks about. He has an example of wine tasting. He looks at like wine tasters and says that ultimately, decision on beauty or art, whatever, is dependent on sentiment ultimately. So it is subjective. But there are people in our society who are better qualified to make decisions on whether or not something is good or not. One wine taster says he can taste iron. The other wine taster says he can taste leather in the wine, a leathery taste. And in actual fact, the wine isn't very good. But when they get to the bottom of the barrel, there was leather left in one, and there was iron left in the other. So he's basically making the point that regardless, that there are people who are qualified make the statement that something is of excellent art or is good or not. I mean,
and Hume is an empiricist.
Yeah.
And he's going to say the world is where we find truth.
Yeah.
Our minds are a reflection of the world.
Yeah.
and we're driven by emotion, by desire, by sensibilities to think different things. But in the end, the source of truth is out there in the world. And it could lead to a sense in which those of us with more refined sensibilities are going to be more attuned to the truth, attuned to truth and beauty than others. Because that's a theme that runs right throughout. Refined good taste, the vulgarity of the masses, the ignorance of people who can't understand high culture, high art, and so on.
He has a role of the expert in that, like, as you say, and I think that's a good point. I think when we're thinking about this stuff, you mentioned about high arts and culture. So we've got a class relationship here. Then you think so social class, various classes, and whenever I think of that, I always think of the relationship between Pierre Bourdieu and cultural capital, as opposed to just social class, because social class is largely an economic shift, isn't it? You've got the traditionally Marxism, you've got the owners of the means of production and the proletariat, the workers. And Badiou goes in this further and looks at. So he's writing in the 80s in France, and he's interested to see how people when they earn more money, the working class, how high art still continued to exist. So if you had, and you do get that now, don't you? Like working class professions largely will earn more money now than traditionally middle class professions. I would argue that the average plumber in the UK will earn far more than the average teacher. And so his argument is that how are high arts and mass popular culture sustained? And he argues that through cultural capital that we are educated into these. You have different tastes. He has that term, habitus, doesn't he? Your habitus is drawn towards, regardless of your class as such, or part of your class.
That habitus idea is very Humean, isn't it? I mean, in other words, I'm surrounded by an environment of symbol and value, which shapes the things I think are important and not important, the things I think are valuable and not valuable, and so on. And that makes the distinction. But for instance, going back to beauty of the human form. It's in the Middle Ages. Just to make a sweet saying like in the Middle Ages, in the 14th century, so ladies shaved their heads way back. So they shaved their scalps way back because a high forehead was considered beautiful.
Yeah.
And men in the Middle Ages wore very tight stockings because legs were the sign of masculine beauty, not the upper body, not the arms, not the guns. Fine leg was esteemed highly in a man.
Yeah. Well, John, didn't you? I remember you telling me once about Victorian men as well with the breeches, and it was cool to have a large midsection and all of your attire aimed. What was that one? It was your pocket watch, and I quite like that one, John. I'd like to see it on that.
Oh, a well-filled stomach.
Yeah.
So you had your watch chain across your stomach, or you had your buttons on your jacket done so that you sort of spread a little bit at the bottom here. Your stomach could be
wrong with that, definitely. Yeah.
Because a man with a good stomach could support a family. He was clearly eating well. He was established in society. He was dependable. A thin man. Goodness me.
Yeah, we don't want that. But isn't that so instantly we've got like a class-based version of beauty, and then we've got a kind of a historical one as well. So it's something that changes over, arguably, what we consider beautiful or attractive, it changes over time in that respect, doesn't it?
Well, that brings you to the third planet, doesn't it? Again.
Yeah.
If that is true, then all we're doing is simply saying that social environments, habitats, cultural values that are mainly connected to power, class, and those sorts of things are simply generated in order to do all sorts of maybe quite malign things, keep the working class in their place because they can't speak Latin or don't like going to art galleries or the ballet,
right,
and so on. All the sorts of things that you might take a sociological view of. And the trouble is with that what that does for philosophy, say it's just purely relative. So where is eternal beauty? Where is universal value?
Plato. Plato and forms. There must be some kind of idea of what the beautiful is anyway. There must be some a priori or something that is beautiful for you to know that something is beautiful anyway, regardless of where you are historically, culturally, social class, wherever you are, your cultural capital. We know inside us that something is beautiful or not. And that relates to the fact that there must be in us, or not even in us, there must be an ideal form somewhere that we can gauge something to. Otherwise, we wouldn't know anything.
And you're describing what Plato there and so on is idealism. For the next 2,000 years, talking about the notion of idealism. I mean, the reason when you come across the idea of forms, it still resonates is because it does feel that way. You see something beautiful and you don't think it's necessarily, you say, well, it's not generated by fashion or anything of that kind. This thing is beautiful in itself. And then you look around the world and you don't find the turd people. In the end, beauty has a certain kind of universal quality. Regardless, I reckon if I went back to the Middle Ages, found a lady with a shaved head and such, I might be, fashions changed and so on. Still think that they thought certain characteristics of beauty they are true now. And they'd run right through time.
Yeah.
So that's why in the emotional sense, the forms seems to be like it's as if you have discovered something that was external to yourself.
Down a little bit about so this idea of like a sort of it's almost ahistorical, isn't it? The something, if you like, is beyond history. It's the Platonic form.
Problem with the forms again, it's open to those that can appreciate it. So Plato think that the common lot can't necessarily see. Some of us can be closer to the forms than others, and naturally enough, of Plato, we said this before, it's philosophers, surprise, surprise, it's philosophers who get closer to seeing the true reality of things than everybody else. So immediately you've got, you're an ignorant peasant.
I'll tell you what, John, I think
easily able to differentiate.
I'll tell you a nice example that might work through is Plato was interested in geometry, wasn't he? Mathematics.
Yes.
That was of a kind of ideal form, wasn't it? A beauty. It was a beauty to symmetry, wasn't it? That's a kind of theme that run through history. I think you skip forward a few hundred years, right into modernity. I mean, modernity and the Enlightenment. There's a kind of beauty to symmetry and order, mathematics, geometry, but an interesting break, I think, from modernity. Again, it's an area you've talked to me before about, a few years ago already, but the Romanticism as a response to modernity and the beautiful.
You get those studies of what the beautiful face is. I remember psychology students doing this one in the past, and they go around showing you which face do you think is beautiful, and you'd have to, and they say, right, what it's a face that is highly symmetric, the sort of golden mean, the exact balance of Fibonacci scale type show. You say, so in fact you can find a universal mathematical sort of beauty. But how is a storm beautiful? How is a looking into a gigantic night sky beautiful? How is standing on top of a mountain, looking at the sunset beautiful? And that sort seems to, and that's where you get to that birth of the romantic, like Edmund Burke and his distinction between the sublime and the merely beautiful, and then Kant in his discussion of the sublime.
I think the sublime is I find this concept really interesting. The sublime is more than beautiful, and the sublime is one of awe and beyond reason. You cannot connect with it. A level of reason, it's mathematical. Mind you, I think there is still a kind of sublime. Well, I'll come back to that in a minute. I say a sublime within the mathematical. I think Kant talks about that. Yeah, this idea of the sublime. I mean, I remember you saying to me years ago about the Romantics. They would take a lot of the train tracks into the Lake District or somewhere, where you would go take the train and admire the landscape because of this idea of the sublime, this sort of wonder.
And a very curious thing is that I remember going to somewhere in the Lake District once where there was a waterfall, and it was very popular in the sort of 1890s or whatever. People would get the train and they would get in a carriage, and the carriage would take them up, and then someone would guide them up to this waterfall, and it was considered so awe-inspiring that sometimes ladies would faint.
Right.
Well, clearly our sensibilities have changed, because this looks like a pretty small waterfall. I've seen Niagara Falls.
Yeah.
Niagara Falls. And so on. That kind of idea that our sense of awe is also, to some extent, I mean, I'm not as, it's highly likely that people were awed by things that wouldn't awe me.
Yeah, so
Because of our discussion earlier about our changing.
the drive of contemporary culture is really one of quantitative, numerical data and the knowable, and reason and order, and the language that we have is one of progression and targets, and is there space really? I mean, I'm trying to think. Well, where is the language of the sublime now?
It's true. Actually, I've never thought of that until you just said it. It's true. It's difficult to find in our culture the language of Romanticism and the sublime.
I'm just thinking, you get people go like traveling still, don't they? And it's still like, you'll get some, like you say, that go to the Grand Canyon, and it was, it was incredible. This kind of like,
Yes.
I even went last year to the, where did I go last year with the kids? To Lake District, and got to the top of, you just mentioned there, I think it's called Red Pipe.
Oh, yeah, right.
I was due a hip replacement, and I had it, or just had it not long before, and let's go on this walk, kids. And it was a 9-hour hike up this hill, but it was like, children are crying, the dogs running around. It was like, what have we done? We've bitten off way more than we can chew. But when I got to the top of this thing, I looked around, and it was absolutely breathtaking. Incredible. I'm guessing it's that kind of thing, isn't it? This idea of the sublime, but you don't. But even the language you discuss it with, I mean, it's not. I guess the language of wonder for the sublime isn't everyday. It's not normalised at all, is it? It's not something you sit down and say. Well, maybe there's a class relationship there as well, perhaps. I'm not sure.
There's some of the diminishment of the sublime must be the lack of danger. I mean, So one of the things that people like Kant, when he describes the sublime, suggests the aspect to it is the sense of your own vulnerability, and that idea of Burke as well, saying that the sort of awed by God, I'm in the storm. I could be struck by a mountain. I'm so tiny in this enormous universe. It's so big, but it's also quite fearful. And in some of today's we're less afraid of this stuff because we're a bit less concerned about our imminent demise when we climb mountains. I mean, some people. I mean, have you ever seen those pictures of people going up Everest, and there's just a queue of people?
Yeah.
Today, going up Everest is just a bit of a package holiday. And in fact, ahead of you there's people, and behind you there's people, and there are ladders on the way, and someone's put a wire up, and every now and again someone falls off something and dies. But really, it's not that dangerous.
Do you think, in some respects, this one you mentioned the other day about the persistence of religion? I wonder whether or not religion offers a language or a way of engaging with the sublime, however you want to look at God, or that more than us, that is greater than the self, if you like. There's still a sense or a feeling of a conscience of something more than, and perhaps that's narrated still through religion, because religion does persist.
Yes,
and it's still very relevant now.
Well, there's a lovely poem by Philip Larkin, a way called Churchgoing, where he says that and Philip Larkin's not religious, and he starts with him saying, don't know why he likes going into churches and he doesn't know why. And one line in the poem he says, I don't know what this frowsty barn is worth, but it pleases me to stand in silence here, in whose air all our compulsions meet and are robed as destinies. You think, well, yes, there's something odd, isn't there? When you go into a church or a churchyard or Stonehenge or somewhere, and you just think of the innumerable generations of humans. You say a step, and it's been worn by people walking on it.
Absolutely.
Or the foot of a statue in Rome, and you say, it's polished, bright by the people touching it for hundreds of years. You think, well, goodness me, we have so little time here. And that must be a sense of awe and danger, that we're mortal. I mean,
I was trying to think of first off, in terms of the sublime, I thought sort of philosophically that there are crossovers here. So Kant actually talks about, he has two versions of the sublime. And I think, before we start, I'd like to do one on Kant, because on reading for this podcast, there's obviously a lot more than we can push into the Uglies discussion. Like maybe we get some readings further down the line with Kant.
We
It's very
entered
interesting.
into the world of Kant's third critique
Yeah,
and judgment.
entered into the world of really hard books. Yeah, but he does bring out these. So in terms of his understanding of the sublime, he has mathematical sublime, and the I think he calls it the dynamic sublime. So the mathematical sublime, and again he goes to concepts of understanding. So you've got this multiplicity. Now, if you look at the stars, it's multiple stars. It's of the sublime. We can't fully understand just how many there are there, but we use the concept, numbers as a concept of something, which then make our senses, make sense of it. And the dynamic sublime is like the physical aspects, like you mentioned, like weather or the sea, or this awe-inspiring like ocean. But we use concepts. But Kant uses the idea of a concept. We kind of put it into words, and it makes sense. I thought this had a very nice crossover with the psychoanalytic ideas around the real. So the real for Lacan is something which cannot be symbolically represented, and in a very basic sense. So he was a psychoanalyst, and the real would be something that it would be of the sublime. You can't approach it directly. You can only feel its kind of effects. It's wonder almost, or it's quite sinister as well. It's threatening, and then through language, for Lacan, through the symbolic, through talking and speaking, you start to make sense of the real. And over time, the therapeutic process is that you change by a kind of word speaking therapy of understanding the sublime, that which can't be directly engaged with, this sort of awe or disgust or whatever it is.
Yeah, and that idea that one of the ways we us 20th century, late 19th century, 20th century people will try to understand our reaction to awe and sublime is analysis. So it'll be Freudian. The reason you're awed is because of there's a part of your mind which you don't understand, the subconscious. The reason you're awed for Lacan is because you're approaching something which can't be represented, something symbolically beyond representation. So that's why you like standing on mountaintops. That's why you like standing on seashores, because they are boundary zones between this and the great infinite beyond. And that touches into psychological areas of your mind that you don't understand yourself.
So there's a nice quote where Zizek here talks about the real, and I thought it was a nice one. He obviously talks about the concept of the real through most of his books, but this one, he's actually speaking about, I think in this sense, is appropriate. He says, the real is the unattainable, traumatic, eternal void, the blinding sun into which it is impossible to look face to face, perceivable only if we look aright from a distorted perspective. If we look directly at it, we get burnt by the sun. And I thought that was kind of like, you only feel its effects, like the sublime is so much that you can't engage with it full on. It's intimidating. It's too much for you to deal with. So we build concepts to try and make sense of this burning sun, if you like, which is at the core of
you can use that to explain what art, or at least some art. It was dangerous to say what art is. What art is trying to pursue, that unknown, that great beyond, that other, that as you say, the thing that can't be fully articulate. It's highly romantic, the observation, isn't it? Ordinarily romantic. That is the, go out into the storm and find no answer to things. And that, of course, was, as we noted in the past, I think that Romanticism of the 19th century, that romantic movement to Kant and right the way through to people like Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer and so on, are all of them reacting to the idea that the Enlightenment would produce a rational understanding of the world, and it didn't, or at least it didn't satisfy.
And largely now we Romanticism now. Is it repackaged? No, it's not, is it? I mean, I don't think the sort of, if we go back to the Uglies, I mean, it's again, we're trying to make sense of this thing of attractiveness, of beauty, in a way that's understandable, that doesn't acknowledge the sublime, does it? It doesn't. Well, I don't know. Or is it grappling with that? I don't know.
Well, that's why I think Kant is interesting in here, because he's trying to humanize this question. So people like so Plato places beauty in the world of the forms,
Yeah.
a kind of beyond our understanding, beyond this material world. And for someone like Aristotle, beauty is in the essences of things. A beautiful hammer is because it does its hammerly job well.
Yeah.
It's because it pursues the essence of care. And for beautiful human being is because it's courageous and honest and intelligent and so on. So in other words, virtue produces beauty. Kant is saying to us, something like, well, the trouble is with that is it places the world is where beauty is.
Yeah.
The external world is where beauty is, but it's not us. So
Yeah.
he's trying to find out what it's like to live in this world.
Right.
And perceive. So for instance, his observation that beauty is true beauty can be distinguished from things like just attractiveness or prettiness or picturesqueness being disinterested. It's a disinterested beauty.
Yeah, disinterested. I thought I got that. I thought that was really interesting. Yeah, you can't be. There should be no utility to it, should it? It shouldn't be for a reason. It has to be you're disinterested. Yeah, and that's something that ran through him and Schopenhauer. I think this idea of a disinterested. I look at something. Is that beautiful? I have nothing else invested in this beyond an object of itself. It has none of my desires. Kind of means that the contemporary ideas of beauty, in the sense that we're talking about it in the Uglies, it wouldn't be beauty to Kant, would it? In that respect, because the attractiveness is for something else, isn't it? It's to be accepted.
What are the people in the Uglies who become beautiful through some process are to be admitted into the circle of powerful or whatever, or the people that and presumably that's therefore power, or it's to be desired.
Yeah,
to all those things for Kant, and he did for all of us, really. You see, is there a charitable act? This is going back to his categorical imperatives, really.
Yeah.
Is there a charitable act that is generally good if you do it to look good? Is there any ethical or aesthetic thing that can be said to be beautiful or good or virtuous if it is done for some ulterior motive? Even if
no, but I tell you, John, that though, that's what you say there though about you bringing ethics there is that I think there is an ethical dimension to the sublime though, and I don't mean it ethical in a sense of morality of looks. I mean that if we go back to that psychoanalytic perspective, there is that the real, if you like, or the sublime, or this kind of like this is where true ethics comes about, because by the ethical act in psychoanalysis is one where a total reconfiguration of the self. The sublime creates change. So in psychoanalysis, this idea of an act, a true ethical act, Zizek talks about this in the early 2000s books. He did Conversations with Zizek, Fragile Absolute. He talks about this idea of an ethical act as something whereby the subject is utterly reconfigured through, I guess in this language we could say, through an experience with the sublime, through something which is all-encompassing, removes any sense of what you once were. And the key here, because Lacan calls it a passage or a passing on the act, if it's for some reason of utility, it has to be for no other reason other than for the actual change itself. So this is why Zizek was interested in Christianity. He is an atheist reading of Christianity, because this total annihilation of the old self to be born anew. I always thought an interesting version was of this perhaps was in the character of Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, the Dostoevsky book. He deals with this guilt. If in effect his guilt of killing the moneylenders, a large part of the book is just him dealing with it. Like he can't cope with it, and it's him battling with the real or the sublime almost. It's this kind of like overwhelming kind of feeling, and in the end he admits to it. I guess it wouldn't be considered an act proper, because Raskolnikov is doing it to be reborn again in Christ. So I'm not sure about that one. I'll have to think about that a bit more. But so this idea of an ethical dimension to beauty and the sublime, I think on the one hand, for something to be beautiful, for Kant, there has to be he sort of talks about a disinterested pleasure. So there has to be no utility to it.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, with the sublime, there is definitely ethical dimension to it. Like, let's just say you go and you see this sublime thing. I don't know, this view, or something happens to you. It can change you totally. Now, you could go traveling somewhere, you might see the Grand Canyon, you think, actually, my life now, the things I thought were important are no longer important. And you hear this happening, don't you?
Yes.
People come away from trips or see something and they're changed.
Very famously, the moon landing guys,
Right.
Buzz Aldrin and the other one,
Yeah.
when they said that, I mean, for the rest of their lives, they said they've been altered by seeing the Earth from.
Yeah.
I mean, the only tiny number of human beings have done.
I mean, another one, while we're on space, I saw William Shatner. Did you see he'd gone up to space?
Yes, they did fired up in one of those rockets by.
Yeah, but did you hear what he said?
He's lost
About it afterwards, though. He said he'd always dreamed of seeing the Earth, of seeing space, and he said all he saw out there was death, nothingness, just void, and really he looked back at the planet and just saw it alive, from up there, to this beautiful planet, and really we were doing the wrong thing by looking away. We should be looking back. I guess that's a sublime moment, isn't it? An ethical change. Yeah.
And that does tap into a romantic notion of ourselves, as being transfigurable, through art, through. If that's true, if all that stands between me and better me is some grand experience, then I'll head off next week to the Grand Canyon, or I'll try and book a flight on Jeff Bezos's giant penis thing, and then declare myself better for it. You do encounter lots of people who say, "Oh, you didn't travel broadens the mind." We did a trip to China, and I come back. I'll never forget that, and so on. And you think so, well, to what extent are you performing that? To what extent is that true?
I'm just going to say that, John, because well, this is what I mean. Though this is what I say about the language changing contemporary culture, because I don't think we have. I think when somebody comes back and says that, there's a level of cynicism. I said, if you listen to somebody and come back, I've changed, I've got this, I'm now this, or it's radically altered. I think that it's usually with cynicism that people, a level of that. I don't think definitely in popular culture, I don't think it's something that you see addressed. And I'm using this as a kind of gauge as to what the masses think about things. Again, because it's a shift away from it.
So as popular culture, it derives lots of its energy from very standard kind of mythical narratives of redemption and discovery and overcoming. Redemption, discovery, and overcoming. And you say, "Oh, that's so." I'm conforming to a narrative. We get back here to cultural studies, don't we? And that a narrative, the way I narrativized my experience in the world. I went, I saw, I'm better. That I'm in that case, I'm the hero of my own story.
So we've got the language of the sublime and the hero. The idea of beauty. If I just go back to, I'm going to go to Schopenhauer now, because so I read a bit of Kant, realised I needed to read quite a bit more of it. Well, if I could, and then looked at Schopenhauer, because I like his kind of metaphysics of the will. The will is this force and representation. The world of will and representation, and he says about art here that acknowledgement of the beautiful is a bit like Kant, this disinterested pleasure. It's a willlessness. So you have to see the thing without any kind of there's nothing else tied to it. You admire something and you see it, and he goes back to Plato's ideas and says that really, if you see a beautiful picture of a tree, let's use that as an example, you see then what it does is there's no other reason to look at it other than it's a beautiful tree, but it's the idea of the tree that you're seeing. There's no, for Schopenhauer, I think it's why he likes the arts, there's no will involved in that. There's not the will, any will later on taken on with Nietzsche, this idea of a force or a willingness to do, or there's underlying drive in psychoanalytic terms of us. When you stop and you look at that beautiful tree, you see only the tree there, and you know it's beautiful because of the Platonic idea of the tree. And he also had a nice response to what we said earlier about, the subjective nature of the beautiful, because he kind of flips that around and says, when the artist sees the tree, he says, look, it's universalized as one case applies to 1,000. Whenever we see a beautiful tree, we all agree that it's a beautiful tree. So we've got a kind of version of universality, a collective version there, and a return to Plato.
And again, that comes back to our initial beginning of this conversation.
Yeah.
The problem for us humans is it universal or is it objective? And if it's forms, it's universal. If it's a will behind, a will which is represented in the world of this world, but there is a will, or was it Hegel's Geist?
Yeah.
You think beyond simple social construction
of the beautiful. And we see that. The division there is. So the sublime is almost, there's a beauty in the overwhelmingness of it. It's almost too much to handle. Yeah. And the various philosophers have a different way of coping with that, whether or not through language, concepts. We try and carve that up, but underpinning that, there is this idea of the too muchness. Like Zizek says, you can't stare directly at the sun.
And that reminds me of the other philosopher we looked at a while ago, Kierkegaard. And Job is told by God to kill his son, and it can't make any sense. Just kill him. Just kill him. God is telling me to kill my son, but he submits to it in a rationalless faith. He simply makes the leap of faith and says, "I shall do this thing."
Yeah.
And in that sense, I would guess that Kierkegaard is expressing a beauty. Because it's utterly selfless, it's irrational, and it's submission of yourself to an exercise of faith.
Yeah.
Which goes back to what you were saying about Christianity, the sort of atheist reading of Christianity, the beauty in Christianity, the sitting in the churchyard, the listening to the Psalms being sung, and thinking there's a kind of transcendent beauty here.
Yeah, and I guess a series of concepts in order of engaging with that as well, even if we don't fully understand it. And I thought the relationship there with the beautiful, the sublime. Schopenhauer has this expression: when you stare at something beautiful, you become pure subject of knowing, and in that sense, it becomes objective. So again, this idea of a collective way of engaging with the beauty. It's not that there's something a priori attractiveness or good art or something which transcends everything, but that in the looking of it, you become pure subject of knowing. So outside of the will, I guess that does largely lay contingent on his concept of this will or the drives, or I guess the passions, isn't it? It's this underlying drives that we have. It's beauty is void of that. Whereas I think if we take the subjective relativist idea, there is. I think it probably ties into our notions of desire, which then become framed culturally and historically.
Yeah, and it's whether if those desires are framed culturally and historically, in other words, they're just as we are, bound in cultural attitude change and so forth.
Yeah.
Then it's difficult to universalize.
Yeah.
Except if the act of submission, like Kierkegaard, that's fairly universal. Or in Kant's terms, the act of our brains are somehow wired with a series of categories and values, which, experience and knowledge and reason and judgment and all these things that are sort of there when you see the world and you understand it in a human term.
Yeah.
You are attaching to some kind of teleological purpose or the purposeless.
Yeah.
So there isn't God necessarily. There isn't a universal form of beauty, but there is my mind constructing in a universal sense some sort of universal categorical ethic, universal categorical beauty. But I can sort of see how if you say, well, do animals perceive beauty? do they have aesthetic? A tiger probably looks at an antelope and thinks, that's a pretty beautiful antelope there, I'm going to have that for lunch. Or a tiger looks at another female tiger, or vice versa, and thinks, that's a handsome tiger. Or, animals spend their existences sharpening their horns or building up the ability to roar. And all of this, Kant would say, none of this is a aesthetic, true aesthetic.
Yeah.
Because it's all bound together with survival and such like. Is it just us then? Is it just us humans? Is it something about consciousness that isn't just that we have a higher sense of our own needs, but we are able to touch something universal? That it's not just that we can never know what the world is, and we construct it in our minds and so on. It's a world in our mind. The mind is the world, but it is not lacking in universality. Contemporary culture seems to lack the sublime.
The kind of discursive, like I said, the discursive response to the sublime very often is one of cynicism. And going back to the Uglies and maybe presentations of self online, this social media now with filters and you were just presenting, it was almost like the Uglies, isn't it? This thing there that I don't think that deals with the sublime either, and definitely with beauty in a traditional philosophical sense of a disinterested pleasure. I don't know if that's there as well, because it seems to be for some.
It's a deeply utilitarian sort of age we live in. So you have your teeth straightened. You go to the dermal filler place.
Yeah.
Why are you doing this?
Yeah.
Because in a sense, you wish to have more success, be more attractive, be appeal to others, operate in the world more effectively.
And that brings to an end this episode of the Spinoza Triad. You've been listening to a discussion between me, John Gibbs, and Dr. Richard Miller, as we applied our understanding of philosophy to the issue of aesthetics and beauty by way of the film The Uglies. If you enjoyed our discussion and you'd like to hear it again, you can find it on Spotify and multiple other platforms. If, on the other hand, you thought that we do in fact live in an age where the sublime still exists, then drop us a message or visit our website, or indeed find our Facebook page. Thank you for listening.